Добрий день. В студії працює Катя Мячіна. Наша гостя пропрацювала більше 30 років на BBC Північна Ірландія, 15 з них вона була редакторкою головного випуску новин. Наразі вона тренує журналістів по всьому світу, від Нью-Йорка до Львова. Наша гостя Анджеліна Фуско. Hello, Angelina.
Hello.
Nice to have you here.
Delighted to be here.
So I'm going to focus on Northern Ireland first because you come from there, and this region is known to have, people from this region are known to have mixed national identities. So my first question would be, do you consider yourself more British or more Irish?
Oh, what a grenade to start an interview with. Well, I come from a Catholic nationalist background. So I would see myself as more Irish than I would British. Mm-hmm. However, I live within the United Kingdom, and I worked for the British Broadcasting Corporation. So there are times when what your heart and your emotion and your background will bring doesn't preclude you from doing your job in a very multicultural society.
Thank you. But speaking about Northern Ireland and bringing it back way back closer to Ukraine, here we have such thing that's called regional identity. For example, people from eastern Ukraine, they may consider themselves more people from Donbas region, not Ukrainian nor Russian. Is this a common issue in Northern Ireland?
I think it's a common issue everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
I think, for example, people will see themselves as either Irish, or particularly in Northern Ireland, they will see themselves as Irish or Unionist or Northern Irish. There is a whole new kind of phraseology where people feel belonging to a place. But I think if you go deeper, people will see themselves as people from Belfast or Derry or Fermanagh people. And so I think individuals and families and communities believe themselves of part of a place. I don't think that's a wrong thing. I think it's just how the history is and the community is. And I think it's important to recognise that people feel that way. So I don't feel exactly the same about, for example, even the education or transport than someone in a rural area, because their circumstances are different. So it's about embracing those differences, about listening to them and trying to see what the connections might be.
Okay. I think this identity problem, if it can be called a problem, it has intensified by the conflict that was happening in the 60s and 70s and so on. And to speak about a little bit about this conflict, because not everybody from our auditory knows about that. It was a conflict between Irish people, and it was a conflict inside Ireland that was about finding the identity, and it was from one side supported by Irish Republican Army, as I understand, and from the other side it was the UK's powers. And Irish Republican Army, sometimes they had these violent attacks on politicians and militarists from the United Kingdom, like British people, and it was quite complicated, obviously. So what was your position on it, both as a citizen and as the journalist?
Okay, I think in fact the issue of Northern Ireland, or the conflict in Northern Ireland, and to be truthful, people can't even agree what it's called, sometimes called the Troubles, as if it's, some inconvenience. To a certain extent, it was like a civil war, but not declared a civil war, because it was not exactly two sides against one another. It was multifaceted. There were nationalists who really preferred to be part of the wider Ireland. Then you had extreme nationalists who were prepared to take arms against the state, which is the UK government. Also, you had unionists who were happy with being a part of the United Kingdom, and then you had extreme unionist loyalists who were loyal to the Queen but wanted to defend, they said, against attacks from the Irish Republican Army. And then in the middle of that you had a government which also put soldiers on the streets and were also responsible for many killings that were not as clear-cut as they originally pretended, and we're now finding out lots of information about attacks that the British Army were involved in, and police force as well. So it was a very complicated time. So from my point of view, it's easier to tell my story. So I came from a Catholic upbringing. I lived in a nice area, and then in 1969, like America with the civil rights, like France with the student riots, people started to ask for civil rights, because there was not one man, one vote, or one woman, one vote in Northern Ireland, because of the establishment and the rules of the state that was set up in Northern Ireland, which was separate from London. So a lot of people took to the streets. There was inequality in jobs, there was inequality in housing, and so people took and demonstrated. And then there were attacks. And I remember when I was young, we had a nice little street, and then we had literally, my sister and I with my mum and dad had to run from our house as people came through the back with guns, because they wanted to clear out Catholics from that area. It was probably the largest mass movement of people. It was before, obviously, the Serbian and Sarajevo and the kind of that conflict, since the Second World War. And both Catholics were put out of their homes, and then Protestants were put out of their homes, and then people started to use bombs and guns and shooting. So in my first year at my school, which was a Catholic school, on a very famous road called the Falls Road, where a lot of nationalists and Catholics lived. In the first year alone, the father of one of my school colleagues was murdered by the IRA. He was a judge, and he was murdered just after the children got out of the car. And then in the same year, my other friend, her father was killed by British soldiers as he walked home, and they pretended and made allegations about him having a gun, but he hadn't. So that was the context in which I grew up. And then I watched people on the television doing the reports from the riots and thought, oh, I'd like to do that. So I went and did my journalism course. I worked in a local Irish News, is a Catholic, kind of mostly Catholic daily newspaper. And you were having to deal with murders and bombings, and seeing lots of things that were very traumatic, and then going home and doing home family life. Then when I moved to the BBC, it was broadcasting, so I was learning all the skills of the radio and television, and we had people turn to the media to find out what was happening, because we didn't have social media, we didn't have digital media. And what we found was you had to literally take your politics and your religion and put it at the door with your coat, because you had to come in as a journalist with knowledge but no partiality on one side. And so we found there were a lot of pressures. We had pressures from paramilitaries on both sides. Our people one journalist was murdered and others were injured, but there were a lot of threats. We also had threats also from the politicians, not in terms of threats to our lives, but pressure about the kind of stories we did. And we in the BBC ran up against the British government a lot. And we were all over the front pages sometimes, and we took strike action because we wanted to have our programmes on air, and the government was pressurising not to run some of those programmes. And I think also it wasn't that we were against people, but it was that we had to keep challenging, and we had to be brave. And some of our people were very brave when they, challenged and asked questions in difficult situations.
Yeah, this is an issue in Ukraine as well, because we're having this conflict in the eastern, but it's like a Ukrainian-Russian conflict, we call it that way. And a lot of journalists, they don't want to cover the stories that are connected to the war or to anything that's connected to it. and because it's really difficult for them to stay distant because it involves them as well. So what are your main tools to stay objective in covering the conflicts and the issue that's connected to them?
I think I was really fortunate in the BBC, but I think in general most of our broadcasting is governed by regulation, so there has to be impartiality and independence. It's really important, and there are regulations about that. There's not the same regulation in the press, in the printed press, so we had to kind of try to do our best. I think we made mistakes as we went along, but we did our best to try and find out what the story was. And I think in the unfolding story of a conflict, some of it's just about the information that you have, what has happened, who has been affected. The why can be difficult. And certainly after a time, I now know, for example, because, you know, government papers have been released or people then tell truer stories after 40 years than they do at the time, that people who were victims, we thought of maybe the IRA or somebody else, they were killed by somebody else because the British government had informers in the various groups, paramilitary groups, and we now know they were responsible for murders or being involved in murders that obviously the state knew about, but we were blaming it on other people. Mm-hmm. So I think if you know that you're not going to get everything right, but you do your best, I think if you ask as many questions as you can, that is the best thing to do. I think also in a conflict, the mistakes that we made probably were about dealing with vulnerable contributors, like the victims and the families of survivors. I think we, again, you know, this was happening, unfolding as we were learning about it. So looking back, I think now, having had some experience with a centre called the Dart Centre for Journalism and Trauma and been in a special fellowship called Ockberg Fellowship, that has shown me improved ways of treating more ethically victims and survivors. I think you will always get one side and another side. Some people have accused the BBC of just saying this side said and this other side said, and not declaring it, you know, as our journalists. But actually that's really hard to do. Unless you actually see it with your own eyes, you don't know what preceded something or what happened after something when you've left. So I think you can only tell the story as you see it and through the eyes of people who are affected by it. That's the best way I can do. And actually ask, are you campaigning for one group or another? And if you are, then you've lost the journalism. The journalism is about what is happening and trying to tell as best you can the whole story of around that. And sometimes you tell the bigger story by a little story. So you might on one day just focus on one particular thing, but over time you will have told the different angles of the story.
But did it take you some time to, when you entered your first journalistic work, did it take you some time to learn how to stay distant from the conflict, from the issue?
I think, you know, maybe I was a little lucky, because we were all new at this and we were young, that in most of the places, even in the paper that I worked in, which was mostly a nationalist paper, there were Protestants who worked with me and were good friends. And so they would ask questions and I would ask questions of them. And so that kept the balance. Having that good conversation inside a newsroom, I think, is really important, to be able to laugh at the differences and be able to ask questions about the differences. We shouldn't just keep, you know, if we have questions we don't understand about another side, then we need to ask those questions. We need to say, like, I don't understand, why this group does this. Can you help me try to get into their head? And I think that's, that can be quite helpful. I think journalists forget to ask questions in a newsroom, because they assume it is a sign of strength not to ask. But actually, I think a sign of strength is asking the questions, is keep probing the questions, keep trying to find out why, what's behind that, what caused that. And I think that makes for better journalism.
During the conflict and now, is there some hate speech presented in the media from one side to another? I mean, different sides.
We now have legislation, we now have laws that don't allow for hate speech. Probably in the early days we had speeches that were, if not hate, 2 steps away. I would say that some of our politicians were quite inflammatory. And you know, nowadays I know one particular politician, and you know, he was very vocal. He was always shouting, and you know, and I don't think there were enough challenges at the time, really challenging the stereotypes that he was kind of talking about. But we tended not to, for example, in years later when some of the terrorist group, the paramilitary groups, would put masks on and they would read statements, we would have big discussions about whether we would broadcast those. Because that can incite other people to take violence, or it can frighten the audience. And so we would have lots of discussions about whether something was inflammatory or not inflammatory. The difficulty is, if you don't hear the voices of people who are, you know, inflammatory or making hate speeches, it's hard to understand. If you don't broadcast them, then you're guilty of kind of ignoring them. But the challenge is, can you broadcast anything that isn't inflammatory and that will not incite or hurt people? So I think there's a big issue because the internet has a lot of that on it, and people can go and see that. So it's important not to self-censor. So you're always balancing the needs of the audience, censorship, from the governments, from the political parties, self-censorship, and wanting to get as much information out as possible. So I think if someone is making hateful speeches or incitement, the easiest way is, rather than just run the clip of them at the news conference, is to try and get the interview where you sit across a table and you ask them to be specific, ask for examples, ask for proof. And I think maybe we didn't do that as much because some of these people are very skilled at not answering the questions. And I think to keep probing that is quite important.
And the Good Friday Agreement, as I understand, was considered to be the resolution of the conflict on the political level. But is there the conflict still in the social sphere? I mean, is there a dialogue between different groups of people, different sides of the conflict now?
Yeah, the Good Friday Agreement was momentous. I think for journalists as well as for the ordinary members of the public, and it was an agreement, and then there was a referendum, and over 70% kind of accepted it, so it was implemented. My team, actually the team I worked in, I wasn't editor at the time, but we broadcast for 17 hours live. Into the agreement. We won an award for it. It was very funny. My boss he didn't want to come off air, but it was unfolding, and we didn't really understand, you know, what it would be. But you know, we are so many years on. There have been very rocky roads. There still have been, you know, after the agreement was signed, one of the worst atrocities of the Troubles took place, which was the Omagh bombing, that August in '98. So we have had murders. We've had lots of ups and downs with the political system. You have people in politics who are still on this rocky road, but they're trying to make it work, make an assembly work of elected representatives who represent all of the people of Northern Ireland. But there are still groups who are paramilitary groups which are illegal. And some of them, some Republicans are still killing, and some loyalists are still killing. but it's a much different place. I have, in the midst of all this journalism, I had 3 children, and their lives are completely different from mine. You know, I worry about things like drugs and alcohol, as well as there are still places you don't want to go to, and you would feel uncomfortable one side and the other.
You mean the places in the city?
Places in the city, places in mostly in around Belfast and in Londonderry. There are more peace walls between communities than were before, but this year I think saw the first wall being opened between communities, and most of the walls and these divisions are in areas where people are socially and economically deprived, and they still blame each other for that deprivation. And there will always be, I think there will always be extremists in any society who don't believe in the state, who don't believe in what people are doing. But it's a wonderful place to be, and one of the things that I am now involved in, now that I'm not involved in the journalism every day, is I'm on the board of the Northern Ireland Tourist Board, and Tourism Northern Ireland wants everybody to come and visit, because we are one of the places that the Game of Thrones is filmed, so thousands of people are coming to see that, and we have some really nice things to offer. But some of the tourism is about the murals on the walls that were there during the Troubles, so people come to see that as well.
Yeah, about these peace walls, is there any possibility for more walls to rise because of the Brexit and the way Northern Ireland voted to remain, but actually
the UK
it didn't
happen? To come out,
yeah.
Well, that's one of the big fears, and it's an unknown and uncertain time, because what the 1998 agreement got rid of the border, so we can now travel north and south without having to stop at customs. But obviously it's the only part of the European Union and part of Europe that is connected with a land border. And so those who negotiated from the national side and also from Ireland don't want a border up there, and it won't be a walled border, but they don't want that, because that defeats the purpose of the 1998 agreement, they will argue. So there's lots of unknowns, and the economy, you know, the Republic of Ireland, its biggest economic kind of where they ship their products and services to is actually into the UK. So there's quite a lot of discussion going on. The first meeting of they have this ministerial council between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, and it met this week just to try and start thinking about what the implications are. But you know, in Northern Ireland and in Scotland, we did not want to leave EU, but obviously the wider UK did, so we're a bit stuck. So we're going to have to wait and see what happens.
And considering the conflict that is happening in Ukraine right now, what do you think are the main lessons that Ukrainian media and society can learn from what was going on in Northern Ireland and in Ireland in the 20th century?
I think I think the conflict is slightly different in terms of how it has started, and I think to try to be as impartial as possible, as independent of government spokespeople as possible, trying to get at the truth, which can be painful and challenging. But I think overall, I think it's also about the survivors and the victims, because each person will have a story, and those stories quite often can inflame others in how they're told, you know, because someone got killed or someone's house was flattened in a bomb or something, and then everybody gets very angry about it. But allowing them to tell their story, remembering that not everything that a survivor and a victim will say is always exactly the truth. It's their truth. It may not be the overall truth, because you and I can walk out of here and we can see a robbery. Okay? We will remember different things depending on where we were, and when the police come to ask us, we'll get things wrong. You know, we'll say the van was the wrong colour because our minds tell us different things. And so we have to remember that we shouldn't dismiss or call victims or survivors, say they're telling untruths. They are remembering what they remember. It doesn't mean to say that that's the facts, the true facts around something. So I think in terms of what we can learn, I think to try to be as independent as possible. I think to treat victims and survivors ethically. And also for journalists to realise that particularly those who are dealing with conflict and tragedy and trauma, it can have an effect on them. So actually building resilience and building newsrooms that allow people to really say, I had a really bad day today, I saw something really terrible, you know, can you give me some support, is a sign of strength and not a sign of weakness.
Thank you. That was really a pleasant to speak to you, and such a bad situation that we cannot speak for many more hours, but the interview has to stop now. Нагадаю, що з нами в студії була журналістка і тренерка з Північної Ірландії Анджеліна Фуско. Мене звати Катя Мячіна. Побачимося.